Mayday is brought to you by our October podcast partners. Our small business podcast partner this month is JordanDene.com. That is Jordan, DENE.com. She runs an apparel and accessories company. It is fantastic stuff. If you have a fandom, you should go check this out. This is functional fandom items. So these are t-shirts, accessories, aprons, all kinds of great things that are themed around fandoms but aren't your everyday looking stuff. You can wear this stuff every day. They're totally fashionable and functional, and I think you will really like what you see. If you have children, they have a kids section that has all kinds of cool stuff. Onesies, kids t-shirts, crayon bandoliers, which I think are one of the coolest, most unique things I've ever seen. So definitely go check them out. JordanDene.com. Once again, it's JORDAN, like Jordan, DENE.com. Our organization podcast partner this month is NARAL Missouri. They are Missouri's largest grassroots pro-choice organization working to protect a woman's right to a full range of reproductive health care for over 40 years. They are doing some amazing work. You might have seen us live stream an event that they were at where they had their Handmaid protest group. Look for more on that as the month goes on. For more information about them, you can go to prochoicemissouri.org. That's prochoicemissouri.org to get more information about NARAL Missouri. Lastly, our wild card, and this one I am very excited to introduce you all to. It is called Geek Girl Brunch. You can find out all about them if you visit their website, geekgirlbrunch.com. This was something that is really cool, very grassroots, started up in New York City by 3 women who were looking to start a women's-only brunch group to just talk about geeky stuff and do geeky stuff with fandoms and all kinds of things. So now it has kind of exploded, and they have chapters all over the country in the United States. There might be one in your city. You don't know. Or a lot of international. There's some at Iceland, Tokyo, just all over the place. So you can visit them, geekgirlbrunch.com. They have a map and a list of their chapters. You can also apply to start a chapter in your city if this is something you are interested in. So visit geekgirlbrunch.com, find your local chapter, or start a local chapter. That is geekgirlbrunch.com. Check them out. So once again, those are our October podcast partners. Thank you to all of them, and we're really excited to promote them and push out some good people doing really cool stuff. This is Mayday, the Handmaid's Tale podcast. Hey everybody, it's Justin from Mayday. Brief introduction here. This is going to be a 2-part interview. This is part 1 with Irish professor from the University College Dublin, Dierdre Flynn. She caught up with us because she followed us on Twitter, and I hit her up and said, hey, thanks for following us, and we got to talking, and turns out she is a college professor teaching The Handmaid's Tale as part of a dystopian novel series, and is also presenting at a conference that had to do with The Handmaid's Tale TV show. So we only thought it appropriate for her to join the show and talk to us about all the things that she was doing with The Handmaid's Tale. So please enjoy this. Once again, this is Dierdre Flynn, a professor at the University College of Dublin, and talking all about her involvement with The Handmaid's Tale. Hello, welcome. This is Justin from Mayday, the Handmaid's Tale podcast. Today we have a very special guest to talk about the Irish take and the Irish happenings of The Handmaid's Tale. Joining me today on the line is Dierdre Flynn. She is a professor at University College Dublin. I ran into her very much by accident on Twitter. She had followed us on the podcast's Twitter account, and I said, hey, thanks for following us. How did you hear about us? And Dierdre said, hey, I'm teaching a dystopian novel class, and Handmaid's Tale is highly involved, and I've also been listening to your podcast, which is still weird to hear people say. So we got to talking, and I wanted to have her on the show for a variety of reasons that we'll talk about. So Dierdre, how are you doing today?
I'm great, Justin. Thank you for having me on.
No, it's awesome. I always love when things kind of happen this way, where I just, out of happenstance kind of run into people and find interesting ways to get them involved. So tell everyone what you teach at the University College of Dublin.
So I teach a number of different classes, but this semester I teach a module called Theatres of Change, looking at theatre that is involved in some sort of change, either aesthetic or social. I'm also involved in a module called The Body in Pain in Irish Literature and Culture. And the most important one, of course, is a module called Contemporary Dystopian Fiction, which is the one where we ended up meeting and talking as a result of.
And so let's talk about that class. And obviously, with The Handmaid's Tale being released, and I know, given the nature of the topics of abortion and women's health and women's rights in Ireland specifically, that it was very popular there, which is one of the reasons I kind of came across so much stuff about Ireland and women's rights. And I did not know a lot about it, to be honest. So it's been very interesting seeing the scope and the differences between the United States and other countries and Ireland. And so had you decided to do this class with the dystopian and Handmaid's Tale prior to all of this coming out with the TV show?
I no, it was the TV show encouraged me to make sure I put that on the module, because I thought that they're hearing about it, they're hearing more about the Handmaid's Tale, and a lot of these students are coming in at first year. They're 18, they're 19, so they may not have heard of the Handmaid's Tale before, or had read the novel before. And when the TV show came out, and it came out just over the summer on Channel 4, and I knew it was coming to TV over here, that I knew that it would be the ideal thing to put on a module, because it would immediately pique their interest. But it's interesting because as I talk to them about it, it's becoming much more popular over here. And during the week, the new committee to meet in relation to repealing the Eighth Amendment, which is where our anti-abortion law is enshrined in our constitution. There's a talk about having a referendum to change it. There was, at their first meeting, a bunch of women dressed up as handmaids who protested outside our Parliament building, the Dáil, during the week. So it was even more poignant that we were talking about it this week as that protest happened.
That's fantastic. And so, when the students, did this make your class a little more popular? Once they started hearing about
We
this?
had a smaller number kind of limit on the students we could take, but it was actually so popular we had to increase the number for it. So students from all different levels of the arts can take the class, from first year to they finished their BA. So it was great. We had a really big interest in it. And the class this week, we were talking about the Handmaid's Tale, and the class was just so enthused about everything about it, and discussing why dystopia was so popular, and why people are so interested in it. And they were saying to me, the students were saying to me, like, they never expected maybe 10 or 15 years ago that you would sit in class discussing American politics and how the world is going, and world politics 10, 15 years ago. But now it's so important that they need to be talking about it in an English module in university. So I thought that was really interesting, that they're so fascinated by it, but finding relevance 1985 in the States, or in Canada, that has relevance to Ireland, which I think is really fascinating, like that they can find something that can cut to the bone, like the Handmaid's Tale. When you see laws in Ireland that are restrictive of women's bodily autonomy, been something that's very much in the news, and then thinking of what's happening in the Handmaid's Tale, been so relevant to them so many years later. Most of them weren't born when the book was written, so
Sure.
it's fascinating.
And so that was going to be one of our first questions here is, so the students that choose to take this class, aside from the ones that, saw the Handmaid's Tale show and were like, oh, this would be great that, this class is incorporating this. What have been the variety of reasons? Because I'm sure not everybody is in there just to talk about the politics and the current events side of the dystopian thing. So what are the variety of reasons you've seen for your students taking the course?
I think as well, it's always nice to have contemporary literature on a course. Books that they have heard of, that writers that they're aware of, that are still alive today, that are still writing. And sometimes it's nice to hear stuff that's very relevant to them. There's a huge growth in young adult dystopian fiction, like The Hunger Games. So this is a way, I suppose, for them to see why there's a growth in it. Why was 1984 the biggest selling book during the summer on Amazon? What is the contemporary dystopian novel telling us about our lives, and where they're going? And I think these students are politically aware and interested. They said to me in the first class that, they're able to access so much information about what's going on in the world, and therefore it can seem like a much more frightening place than maybe it seemed 50 or 60 years ago, when you didn't have access to all that international world news at your fingertips in real time. That now all of this stuff is happening, and they're learning so much more, that they feel that they want to know what how writers are responding to that and how they're representing that in the works that they're writing. And are these novels warnings, or are they blueprints, or are they ways for us to help understand our society better? So
So,
I think that's kind of some of the reasons they're coming into it.
sure. So, what have you seen them get out of it? So, this course is completed, correct? This was last.
No, we're still
Oh,
on it. We're
you're
still in
doing
the
it right
middle of
now.
it.
Oh, excellent,
So
excellent.
yes,
So let me
yeah.
ask you then, since you're right in the middle of it, what have you seen from, say, the beginning of someone coming into this course, reading a few of these books already? What are they getting out of it? What have you seen as far as their insights and anything that changed in their perception or their opinions?
I think they're seeing how, first of all, with Handmaid's Tale, how a book from 1985 can still be very relevant to them a number of years later, and um, can have a number of warnings for them. I think a lot of them were really interested in how people didn't stand up and stop what was going on around them, and that was really fascinating to them. And I think as well, one of the books that we have on the module is Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, and a lot of them have found that really like a very frightening novel to read, as well. That the Parable of the Sower is such a it's so it could be written about this time right now, again written in the 90s, and they're
So
finding
real
it
quick,
really interesting.
not to interrupt, but
Yeah,
if you could give our listeners and for me, because I have heard of that book, but I have not read that. So give us a brief rundown on the synopsis of the Parable of the Sower.
it's about a young girl who's living in a kind of a gated community, and they are going through like abject poverty. It's very hard to get work, particularly if you're a person of color, or in a mixed race marriage. And they are kind of trying to. There's huge unemployment, huge poverty, and a lot of the towns and jobs are owned by large corporations, and you end up signing up to live with the company and paying to work for them and just being able to get by. And this young girl is living here with her family in this kind of community where they're trying to provide for themselves off the small patches of grass that they own. They can't afford new windows, they can't afford shoes, and slowly but surely, the people outside of their community who are mainly homeless or involved in or have no work, can have very little access to healthcare or education, are coming in at night and taking their stuff, and they have to move and go on the road. And at the time, they have this new president that's just been elected and promises to make the country great again, and his name is President Donner. And
Stop it! You
it's
need to stop talking right
yeah,
now because that is
frightening. It's so
that's already
frightening.
the most terrifying thing I've ever heard.
Yeah, and you feel it. You feel it coming. You just feel, oh my God, these things are happening closer and closer. We're selling ourselves to big companies all the time and bits of our information, and they own us, and we're indebted for life, and our children will be indebted for our debt. Oh, it's unbelievable, unbelievably frightening as well.
So
So it's
when
really interesting.
so when you get into a book like that, that really is like not that far around the curve if things don't improve. Um, what is the reaction that you see? I know when I read The Handmaid's Tale, because I did not read The Handmaid's Tale until this past winter before the show aired, and it blew me away with how it could have been written yesterday and it would all still be
Yeah.
relevant. And does it take them by surprise how relevant a lot of this is?
Yes, it does, and they seem to be very, as I say, politically aware and politically interested. And I think it's frightening to them when you read something like that was written as like 20, 30 years ago, and that it could be so true to life. That this has been something that people have been saying this could happen, and you're watching it happen around you closer and closer. And I think for them it's a real warning that we need to be very aware of this. We need to stand up, we need to protest, we need to make sure that we're politically active, or that we are aware of these things, and then we're not just reading about these novels where these things happen, that we're actually don't happen, if you know what I mean, that we're
Right.
using them
Working towards
to inform.
solution based, actionable change.
Yeah, exactly. Like thinking, if fertility is in trouble, like what do we do? How do we encourage families to have more children, and how do we make it much easier for people to have that lifestyle if they want to have children, but also be able to afford to live. But I think
It's,
it's interesting for them. Like, it's frightening for them to
oh,
watch this, but
I'm
they're
sure.
fascinated here.
I'm sure, because when you're that young, I mean, you think you know a lot, especially when you're coming into college, and your exposure to the world, even today with so much media access, is still relatively limited, especially
Yeah.
within context to things that have happened in the past that maybe they just are unaware of, or things in areas of society that they just haven't been exposed to. So have you actually seen in the students that you're teaching right now, them moving towards things that are, protests, actionable change, going beyond the book and the course?
I'm wondering, and I think that's something we're going to talk about towards the end, what they will do. I think that's something I want to see, if it is something that makes them become more politically active, or how they will use the information that they've got from these novels, and if it does make them take a step forward in some sort of way. And I think that's something that we'll probably discuss at the very end of the module, as we come close to the end, to see how it might impact their behavior in the future, or towards the end of the class, have they in some way changed anything that they've been involved in, or got involved with somebody else. We talked in relation to the Handmaid's Tale how Luke doesn't get up and protest in relation to June or Moira losing their rights and their freedoms and their money. To see, can we find other relevant things that are happening with us that they could say, okay, we need to make a change on this, because it could be us next if we don't do it.
So talk to me about how you put this list together for the class. What was your criteria, and talk about some of the other novels that you've incorporated.
So I wanted to make sure that we got a really broad sense, that I wasn't just looking at Irish novels or UK novels, that I wanted to get something that show and to show a range of different types of dystopia in some sense. So we started with The Handmaid's Tale because of the TV show, and I thought it was a good start. It's 37 years ago that it was published, so I felt that made it pretty contemporary. There was the television program, and I felt that kind of made it contemporary again for them, and made an interesting start. The second novel, then we went in time chronologically. So the second novel we've picked is Haruki Murakami's Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. I wanted to give them an example of something that wasn't particularly Western either, so to look at something like that. And it's a fabulous novel, and it is set in Japan. He wrote it in 1985. I think it was translated then in 1991, and it is about a man who works as a calcutech, so like a human computer for a company, who have basically controlled his mind and played around with his brain so that he will be of better use to that company. At the same time, there's another world, an alternating world happening, kind of set in like nearly like a walled town, post-war walled town, where there's not much technology whatsoever, and you have to kind of leave behind part of yourself, your shadow, in order to live in that town, and lose your memories and lose your extreme emotions so that you can live there forever. And these two worlds that are happening at the same time end up colliding towards the end. It's a really, really fascinating novel, but dealing with technology, and again, maybe the kind of isolated postmodern existence. Third novel then is Parable of the Sower of J.B. Butler, and I think it really interestingly deals with race and also religion in America. And I think, again, because of its frightening nature when you read it, it's just such a fascinating novel. I think it makes a really good case for something that's very close to the bone, that's very realistic, but really importantly deals with race. And I think that's another really important theme that sometimes might get left to the side in some of the dystopian novels, because a lot of them seem to be can be very white and male. So this is, I think it's a really interesting one. The fourth novel then is Sarah Hall's The Carhulian Army, which was released in the States as Daughters of the North. And it's set in the UK in 2007. She wrote it, and again, just in a couple of years' time, but dealing with austerity in the UK. There's been a war, and the UK has lost, and they're very dependent on the States. There's been the population has been controlled. People live in poverty, and it's about one woman who leaves to go to this Carhulian army who live in the north of England, in the hope that she will find a group of women who are working there together, kind of as a resistance, but in some way dealing with a woman who decides to turn to terrorism in some way to escape the situation that she's in, and why maybe we turn we turn against the system, and how we deal with austerity in some way. The fifth novel is Kevin Barry's City of Bohan. Kevin Barry, the Irish writer, he wrote it. It's set in 2053 in the west of Ireland, and kind of he talks about this lost time that has happened, and now there's no more juice. So again, dealing with kind of issues of fossil fuels disappearing, but in a very violent kind of future. And then the final one we'll finish with is Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11, which is a really fantastic. It's about a pandemic, so a really totally different kind of style of dystopian future, but a really fascinating one as well. And it only came out in 2014, so it's pretty new as well.
I think you did a great job there of covering kind of all the possible terrible ways that the world could be terrible. Pandemics, technology, all of it is all there. So good job. I'm sure your students will be thoroughly terrified with the state of the world. They probably should be. That's probably good, because sometimes that's what it takes to make things happen, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I think as well, a lot of them, and particularly Station 11, there's a lovely sense of hope in some of these novels as well. And I think that's really important, the sense of resistance, that resistance can be positive and can make things happen. And hope is important too throughout all of these things.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. Please head over to allconsumingcontent.com for more great podcasts you can check out. Back to the Money Bin, a DuckTales podcast, Player vs. Player podcast, and Blues Hockey podcast. You can also check out our radio station at Handmaid's Resistance Radio, that is on Slacker Radio, or for free on the Slacker app.